But tonight we're going to have a presentation on Jetpack Compose Essentials. And I'll hand it over to Brian to take it over.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I just muted mine. Cool. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Brian Warnick. I've been doing software development professionally for a little over a decade, with the vast majority of that focused on Android development. So today I'm going to talk about the Jetpack Compose Essentials. And there's things in here that I think will be good refreshers for those of you that have been using Jetpack Compose, and might be interesting and new topics even if you have been using it for a little while. And then again, for those that haven't, it should be a good overview of what is coming up. So let's talk about the fundamentals of Jetpack Compose. What is it is the first question that we want to answer. And to understand this, Jetpack Compose is a declarative framework for building Android application UIs. This is not to be confused with Compose multi-platform, which has targets for web, iOS, and desktop. Today, we'll specifically be talking about Jetpack Compose, which is the Android variant of Compose and the first one that was developed. But why would you use Jetpack Compose over Android XML layouts and any other frameworks? Well, the first one is kind of in what the description of what Compose is that it is a declarative framework for defining your UI instead of imperative. If you're unfamiliar with these terms, imperative UI is predefining all of your application UI and then mutating that state based off of information that you have available later, while declarative is a way to make more of a pure function where you have a specific input and that will always result in the same output. So an example of this is if we have a screen that has a list of items when there are items, or an empty state when there are no items. With Android layouts and XML, excuse me, you will define the recycler view in your layout file, and then in that same file, you will define your empty state or include your empty state. And then in your activity or fragment, whenever you get the list loaded from like your repository through your view model, you will either set the visibility of the recycler view to visible when you have items, or to hidden when you don't. And then with the empty state, you will set that to visible when you do not have items, or hidden when you do have items. And so you're just mutating that state that you defined in your layout file earlier. Where with Jetpack Compose, you have a function that takes a list of items and basically you're asking it, hey, give me the UI for this list. And so when you have actual items, Compose will return you, or declarative frameworks, excuse me, will return you the representation of that list. Whereas if you don't have any items, they'll still return you a representation, but in this case, the representation would be that empty state. Compose also decouples your UI from the operating system version and your manufacturer. We all know that there are a couple of manufacturers that modify low-level view workings, as well as having slight inconsistencies across different OS variations. And with the support libraries that we get that build on top of the Android view system, it solves a lot of those problems, but it doesn't solve all of those problems, because some manufacturers will still go into the low-level code and change it. And the support library is working on top of that low-level code and expecting it to have certain functionality. And if that is changed, then it can cause inconsistencies throughout your application on different OS versions and different manufacturers. So having, yeah, Michael.
I just want to give an example of where an OEM has tweaked some base level UI.
I don't have an example or like a specific example on mind right now. I know that in the past I've hit, with Samsung in particular, I've hit issues where the way that their list was, or excuse me, their I'm thinking Compose terms. No. They're like a column. So like it is a list. Yeah. Anyways, the way that worked and was making some modifications with the views and sizing it would cause inconsistencies in like the sizing of the children views.
there's also some instances of different OEMs setting, like if you did like Android colors got white.
Oh yeah, the
It might not be the
colors.
same white.
Yeah, the colors could potentially change.
Yeah.
Again, I don't have a specific example. That the colors is a good one. I'm sure strings is probably one that has changed. Like I'm sure Samsung will change like the OK text string to mean something else. I have seen that actually. I don't know if it was Samsung, but I have seen like the Android strings.OK, or maybe it was yes, to output something I didn't expect it to do. And then the third one for why you would use Jetpack Compose that I'm going to talk about here is that it's more of a cohesive UI. So with your Android layout files and your activity and fragment, you're splitting the definition of your layout into your XML layout, and then tightly coupling that layout to your code inside of your activity or fragment. Maybe you're using view binding to do that coupling, but you have two locations that are really referencing the same thing. Where with declarative UIs, it is the determination of what needs to be shown and actually representing that is all located in one spot.
And one language.
And one language, yes. So what we're looking at here is a very simple implementation of a screen in Jetpack Compose. And the first thing that I want to point out is Compose uses annotations, the @composable in this case, to define a function that presents or provides UI. Now, Compose itself doesn't actually return the UI. If you're familiar with like React, you're actually returning UI in React for it to present. Compose doesn't do that. It actually uses the composable function annotation to understand that it needs to go and introspect that function and determine what UI will be included in the presentation. So in this case, we have a pretty simple layout, a box. Think about that as a frame layout if you're used to Android layout XML. And then inside of that, we have a text. We're just centering that text here. Now, the first thing that I want to point out is both that box, that layout, and the text include a modifier. If you're familiar with Android layouts in XML, the typical thing that you'll use attributes for would be sizing the views, adding padding to the views, the positioning of the views. And this is pretty much the same with a modifier in Jetpack Compose. You need all of those. Additionally, there's a lot of other things that you can build into it. So here you can see for that layout, the box, we're just making it fill the whole size of the screen. And then that text, we're aligning that in the center. The other thing that I want to point out is the box, and this is just by convention. The last argument in a function, typically a layout, will be your content lambda. There are a couple other functions that take content lambdas that are not the last argument, and that there's good reasons for that in those cases. I'm not really going to jump into those, but just know that as far as layouts are concerned, so box, column, row, and then your lazy column and lazy row, which you can think of as your recycler view, those all take the last argument as a lambda. And in this case, you can see it's a box scope to that lambda. Each layout type has its own scope. So column would have column scope, row would have row scope. And typically those are used for additional modifiers. So here this text has the align modifier. That's actually scoped to that box scope. So is only available inside of the box layout. Now your column and row also have very similar scoped align modifiers, but those only center either vertically or horizontally, whereas the align in the box does both vertically and horizontally, excuse me.
So they make sense contextually within their context.
Yep.
So it's one though when you're just importing and like you import the wrong one or you switch from the box to it.
Yeah, that is a good point.
Readjust.
Occasionally you will import the wrong one and it'll just be like, you're giving me a different alignment than I expect. And you just have to make sure that you go and import the correct one after that.
Yeah, or sometimes I've noticed this is more a fault on the tooling, is it will sometimes offer the ones you don't have. But like I've seen it offer
For input.
I've seen it
Oh.
offer like alignment.center, even though you're in a column.
Oh, yeah,
It's
yeah.
like
The
you'll
tooling,
run into some tooling issues.
yeah, the tooling definitely can be improved as far as the scoped modifiers go. And then what does this look like? Well, this just looks like a hello world with that centered on the screen. So now that we've talked a little bit about modifiers, I want to mention that modifier ordering matters. So a good example is in Android layouts in your XML, you could define both a padding and a margin. Now, Compose does not have anything called margin, and there's a good reason for that. It's because the order of your modifiers actually matters and affects what comes after it. So in this case, we have two nearly identical boxes. The only difference is on line 4 and 5, the clip and background are inverted between the two. Now, this should be pretty straightforward to understand and reason what this is going to look like, but this is just one of those good examples of understanding why ordering or what the ordering matters and why it does this. On the left, you see that we clip before we draw the background. And so anything that comes after that clip will be forced to abide by the shape that you pass in. While the one on the right, we go ahead and draw the background, which doesn't have any modifications to it beforehand. So it just draws the whole square, and then we'd clip. So if we added another item here, then the one on the left, the rounded or clipped before background, the item would be completely filling that box with the rounded corners. Excuse me. While the one on the right, we would still see the like triangle-esque corner things poking out behind the new shape that we draw.
Could you add a second background?
Yeah. So yeah, one of the great things about Compose is you can add multiple backgrounds. Yep. Yeah, so it's called the background here. It's really just drawing it. So yeah, underneath this clip. Modifiers. Yeah. I sometimes I'll say attributes, but yeah, they're definitely modifiers. A big example of this is padding. Like if you add padding after your size, just be aware that's going to act more like padding in Android layout land. And if you add it before the size, it acts more like a margin, which is beneficial. Like if you want to use it that way, that's why they don't have a margin modifier. The other one that I like to use is clickable. And typically I like to round my clickable shapes. And so I clip before I make it clickable.
Otherwise your ripple.
Yeah, otherwise your ripple will either.
You usually clip first and then do your clickable.
Yep. And it clips whatever the ripple of the clickable.
Yeah, because if you do it first, then like your clickable will be the rectangle rather than the rounded shape. So,
yeah, and so you can make it whatever shape. So in this case, we use rounded corner shape. There's a couple, I don't even remember what the other ones are, honestly. But like, yeah, you can make it a circle because it can take a percentage as well. So this one takes a specified DP, but you can do one that takes a percentage, so you can just make a circle.
You can also pass in the values for each corner.
Yep. Yeah, each corner independently.
The values for each corner.
Yeah, so right here, this is passing in 8 DP for all 4 corners. If I wanted like the top left corner to be 2 DP and everything 8, then I would pass in 2 DP for the top left and then 8 for all of the others. Yep. Yeah, the padding is that way, sizing is that way. So size has your typical like width, height stuff. You can also define min width and min height, max and max. You can do restrict it to in a certain range.
So that's how you can do like a chat bubble that has like a pointed
Yep.
corner and the rest of it's round.
With the clipping, yep. Yeah, you could make 3 of those corners, 8 DP, and then 1 is 0 DP. And then that would make that chat bubble.
And also in all technicality, depending on what you're wanting to do, the background can also take in a shape.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
you
so
could get away with
a key on that. So yes, the background can take a shape. That shape will only affect the background. So here where I say clip and then pass in a shape, the rounded corner shape, and then I call background, anything that comes after that clip is modified. But if I call background, pass in that color, and then the second argument, you can pass in a shape, and I passed in the same thing, it would look the same right now, but if I did like a clickable after it, the clickable would still be all the way corner to corner and not rounded.
Okay. So yeah, it just depends on what effect you're wanting to have.
Yeah, so honestly, there's more than like 100 modifiers, counting some of the variations, right? So like size takes like a single argument, has two arguments, it has like padding has, you know, horizontal and vertical different arguments on one, and then you can also do like start end. But yeah, there's about over 100 modifiers to really define what you're using, but typically I only use maybe like 20 or so of them at most. So I want to talk about previews because this is how we've actually been seeing what the output of the UI was. And here, the way that you can define previews in Compose, sorry, my thing got in the way. So the way that you define previews in Compose is it's a normal composable function. By convention, I personally make them private because nothing else should be calling them. And then you use the annotation at preview. In this case, you notice we have an argument that says show background. I just always do this so that there's a background drawn behind whatever I'm trying to preview. There are other arguments you pass in. The most notable one is being able to define the UI mode, which allows you to specify if it's light mode or dark mode, essentially. And then there's a bunch of others. Like you can actually add a frame to it. So if you really want it to look like a device, you can set the screen size if you want it to be a device. Yep. Yeah, there's a lot of things that you can define in the preview arguments, but typically this is pretty much what I do. Now, note, you can have multiple preview annotations on a single composable function, and those will both render.
Out of curiosity, I myself, I tend to do preview above composable.
Oh, really?
The reason I do preview under is because I add arguments. And for me, I like to have longer lines below shorter lines.
Have the pyramid.
Yeah, it's just it's just a visual thing. Yeah. No. By default, if you use like the prev that's built into the IDE, it will, I think, put preview above composable. But it doesn't add any arguments.
It's just pure semantics.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely like, what is your preference?
I was just curious because I'm like, I always do preview and then composable just because like it's previewing a composable. No, like the longer lines making it give more of the pyramid effect.
Okay, so the other thing that is optional is you can take a preview provider, which is defined through the preview parameter. And then you pass in the class for that. So the preview provider is actually an interface that you implement. So in this case, we implemented it to provide a data class called checkbox info. And because we're only paying attention to checked and enabled states, I just made a matrix of those 4 possibilities. And now when we pass that in as a preview parameter, you'll notice that we actually only take one item, checkbox info. And so the framework will actually call this function 4 times, one with each of those checkbox info that I defined. And so you'll see this is what the output is. The top 2 are disabled and the bottom 2 are enabled, and then the right 2 are checked.
So what other composables would make use of this preview parameter? I mean, is it any of them can have that?
Any, yeah. So I use checkbox just because it's a predefined component, right? Everybody knows what it does. But yeah, so typically I actually only use preview for components I make. So like if I can do it for like a whole screen or for different segments of a screen. And you'll see like a list item. If I have a list item that I want to ensure while I'm developing that it looks right in every state, then I would use a preview for that list item. And then, of course, I would probably use a preview for the whole list, and then a preview for like a toolbar, like just
exercise the combinations.
Yep. And that's one of the big advantages of preview and compose is you can exercise and see all of the variations that you have within a single component, where with Android layouts, you could use tools, but you are always like hard coding that to define a single case.
Sometimes I see our teams that do like a sample app,
Mhm.
and they create a screen and instantiate each component with its various
Yes.
flavors.
So here's one of the really cool things about Compose previews. You can run that in your application. So there's an option, and I'll show this later, but there is an option to actually run that preview within your application. So it'll start even if it's private.
It's more, you can run it on device.
Yeah. So yeah, it'll run it on the device, but it packages it with your APK. Yeah. It's really cool.
So, well, by default, are previews adding code to your APK then?
Mm.
You have to do something.
I mean, yes, they're going to be adding code because you're adding a function here.
But it doesn't wipe that out of like the bytecode.
I mean, if you use R8 or ProGuard and it strips unused functions, then it will remove your preview functions.
Okay, and also remove the ability to bring it up in your app.
Well, yeah, you will. So you won't be able to bring it up in your app unless you run it through the preview in the IDE.
Okay.
Basically, just see previews as.
I mean, that's why I make them private so that nobody accidentally calls them from somewhere.
You can bring it up on your.
Yeah, so that's through the IDE. So the IDE, when it shows the preview, so like what we're seeing on the right side with those 4 checkboxes, there's actually options there. One is like inspect, and it'll just like allow you to interact with it in the preview. But then there's also one that's run on device, and it'll run it on your device, but it's also technically like packaging it with your APK.
Basically, you can see previews as a form of documentation.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you're making a design system of like here's a text input, here's a button, here's the toolbar, here's all these things. Like obviously you'll have your Java docs with all the params of what it is, but then you should also have a preview showcasing that composable. That way a developer can come in and they can easily both see and read.
So the preview is in the Java docs, is what you're saying?
No, it's going to be separate. But like your file, like here's your
right now the preview will only be visible in the IDE.
So not like a release build down Google
No.
Play. It's
No.
Yeah. That's cool though.
We had a question from Jacob. I'm not 100% sure what it was in reference to. So
I think both of you are muted. So if he tries to speak.
No, I'm not muted.
Oh, you're not muted.
He's not muted.
Oh, hey.
I
I was
muted my
listening to the
speaker.
discussion
That's
and
what's going on.
Yeah, that's
and
what I meant.
I think I got my
Okay,
answer.
sorry.
Or my question.
Yeah, hold on. All right. Sorry, Jacob. I was muted. My speakers were silenced.
Oh no, you're good. I was just gonna say that I think through the discussion, I think maybe my question got answered. I think maybe ProGuard has been ripping out my my previews, perhaps, or something. But I've seen that feature that you're talking about. You're able to click next to the preview run on device, and for whatever reason that button has never worked.
Yeah, and I can show that a little bit later too. But yeah, when you're running R8 and ProGuard, so like when you actually run your application, probably in production mode for R8 and ProGuard, then it will strip those unused functions by default. But yeah, if you're just trying to run on device, it should work fine.
Yeah, I mean, well, if you've got a maybe later in the presentation, that'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. So that's previews. And just to note, like all of the UI that you're going to see here is essentially through previews. There are a few items that are videos that are through either the emulator or the layout inspector. All right, so let's talk about lists, because this is one of the big areas in Compose that is so much nicer than Android layouts and view systems. So let's talk about the list item first. Let's just make a very simple list item that follows material design guidelines. So it's the right height, it's indented the right amount. And you'll notice here for the box, the layout modifier, we're setting the width. We're setting the default min size, which in this case is just the height, to 48 dp. And that's done so that if the font on the device is set to like extra large, it will grow appropriately and not restrict the size of the elements to where it's starting to clip things. And then we set the padding horizontal. Again, this is because it's below the size, it's indenting the content of that composable. And
are the rounded corners just a a default?
So the rounded corners is just, I did that for the presentation. It's actually, the list item itself is still a rectangle.
Okay. Here's a question I have. So right now you have the min height set 48, and then you obviously like your text so like center. Now as it scales, does it start scaling the moment, or like will the height scale appropriately with the font, or would you need to set padding?
I would need to set padding.
Yeah.
I mean, in this case, like once the font becomes larger than what is visually 48 dp, then it would grow. But yeah, right now I would need to set padding. Yeah. No, great call out.
I didn't miss anything because hold up. I'm a fan of using min heights and max heights, but I usually never really set max. I usually never set sizes.
You're right.
I just base stuff off of padding.
Yeah, I should definitely have added padding to the text.
So like instead of, you can have it centered still, but you'd say like on the text you'd have a modifier for padding of like vertical of like 16 dp. So that way it's always
not the box.
Yeah, on the text.
That way, as soon as the font grows, it's still going to be 16 dp away from the edge of the stuff.
Yeah, I can't remember single line. It might be 20 dp, but yeah, you would set some appropriate amount of spacing between the top and the bottom, and then the list item itself would grow as the font size increases or decreases.
And your preview could showcase different font sizes.
Yes.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so you'll notice I want to mention align in this case because it's still under box, but you can also do center start. So that's like, center vertically, but start horizontally. Cool. I didn't go back by accident. And then let's do the list. This is it. Like, this is why it's so cool. Okay, there's actually a little bit more that you can do. So you can actually pay attention to like the scroll state, but this is really how you define it. We take a list of items. Right now they're just strings. And then we do a lazy column because we want it to be a vertical list. If you want it to be horizontal, you do lazy row. We take the modifier, do the same thing there. We do set content padding. You could set padding on the modifier for the lazy column itself, but that would cause the content to be clipped as you scroll. And so that padding would always be visible. So lazy column and lazy row have a content padding argument that adds padding, in this case vertically, so on above the first item and below the last item, that will scroll away with your content to follow the material guidelines. And then items is a scoped function that takes 3 arguments. You only see 2. Don't worry about that. So the first one is list items. That's just the items that you're trying to display. The second one I'll get back to in a minute. And then the third argument is a composable lambda that takes the content for that list item. In this case, it's just that list item that we were looking at before. So we're just passing that in. And then I'm also setting that as clickable, even though I'm not doing anything, just to kind of show, hey, that's pretty easy to do. Now that second argument that I skipped is actually a key provider. If your list items are changing order, or you're adding new ones frequently, or just changing them in general, you'll want to add a key provider that will allow you to give the framework a unique ID for each of these items. And that should be, unique per the data set of that item. So if that changes, then Compose will know, okay, I just need to build and recompose a new item instead of, just using what we previously compiled for this item. So it's just an optimization that you should be aware of.
You don't have to use named parameters because it knows the third one's a lambda.
Yep. Yeah. And then what does this look like? Well, it looks like again, ignore the rounded rectangle part of it, but so it just looks like a list. This already has your scrolling, handles your over scrolling. So pre Android 12, it does the halo on the top and bottom, and then Android 12 and up, it does the stretching.
Now, what's your thoughts on like list items? Should it be in a different file, lazy column, or your
it depends.
Your file
I'll get into that a little bit later too, but for me, it really depends on reusability and how large things are getting. So like in this case, in the same file, I would have my list item and my example list in the same file. The list item would probably be private, because nothing else is going to be using it. And so that is one of the big things for me with Compose is pretty much everything in Compose is private for me, except for reusable components and of course like your screens, which are public or internal.
A key thing to keep in mind when it comes to like when to break out a file is when your code is getting compiled. The larger the file, the worse it is for performance and compiling.
Yep.
I think it's like 200 lines plus, I think, is where it starts getting. I could be wrong.
When you have a lot of files?
Yeah, I think it's probably 200. I think you might start to see 200 lines in a file, a composable file. You probably start to see a little bit. I haven't really noticed much on some of the larger ones that I've worked with that are probably around 400 or 500 lines. But for me personally, like once a file gets that large, I'm like, I need to break something out into another file because this is just getting unwieldy for me.
Composable, it should be.
I mean, if you have a composable that's 200 lines long,
you need to break it up. I'll get into why later.
But also, like for me, like say I'm making a button, and there's 5 different variations of that button. I'd probably still keep them all in the same file, even if it's like 300 lines.
Yes.
Just because it's
composable.
Yeah, if you have different variations of the same thing, I would keep those in the same file.
But there's just some compiler-based reasons you may want to break it up.
Yeah.
And also other performance reasons you want to break up the function itself.
Yes. So let's talk about phases. There's 3 phases for Compose to present your UI. The first one is composition, second one is layout, and the third one is actually drawing. So the first one, composition, this is when Compose is looking at all of your Compose annotated functions and basically running the logic in them to determine what is going to be presented. So that earlier example of having a list or an empty state, Compose would look at the input and send that through that function and then basically monitor what composable functions were logically run and include that in its snapshot to know to present later. Once it's...
I was going to say, under the hood, it's doing a lot of tree-based stuff.
Yes, under the hood, it is a lot of tree stuff going on.
There's people that have taken the Compose compiler to do stuff with that are tree-based things, just because it's a phenomenal compiler for doing stuff tree-based because it's so performant.
Yeah, that's crazy. But yeah, so it builds a tree under the covers. You basically never need to know that. Layout is when it calculates the size and the position of your components. So one difference between Android layouts, so your view-based layouts and Compose layouts, is Compose, you basically get one layout pass. And once that's done, that's all you get until you basically request a relayout. With Android layouts, you can have a back and forth and multiple layout passes just to figure out the first positioning and sizing of all your children. That's why in Android layouts, you don't want to nest your layouts too deep. Otherwise, you're going to have basically squared or cubed layout degradation. And then the third part is drawing. I'm not going to go into that. I think you can understand what drawing is actually going to be doing. So now that we understand those 3 phases a little bit, I want to talk about what if we want to do some logic. So in this case, like sorting an array or a list. Now, realistically, you should be sorting this list in like your view model or a use case. You really shouldn't be doing it in your UI, though there might be a case for that every once in a while for very small things. But in this case, for an example, we're going to sort a list. And to understand when that is happening, I'm going to go ahead and log that we're sorting that list. Now, assume that we're actually using that list. We're not, but just assume we are. And then what we're doing here is anytime we click the action button, we're triggering a refresh. Basically, we're incrementing the title. So what this looks like, if we go ahead and run that video, and I'm sorry for the quality because I thought it was going to be a little bit better, but you notice that as we click the button each time, it's incrementing the title, but it's also causing our list to be sorted again. And that's not really what we want in this case, because in this case, it's a short list, not that big of a deal. But if you're doing something much more computational, or this list is long, so more computational, then that's really not good. So we can make a very simple change and use a keyword in Compose called remember. Now remember takes a variable set of keys. So we just pass in items as the key because that's what we're going to be basing our calculation off of. And then that just returns the result of that. Now remember, well, based on that key, if that key doesn't change, but another recomposition happens, then it's just going to return the value that it had previously because it's like, well, you didn't pass me a new key, so it's going to be the same thing. So make sure you're passing in appropriate keys when you do this. As a note, you don't have to pass in a key. So you'll see that in a minute, but you can do 0 to however many you want. In this case, we do list. So if we go ahead and play this one while it plays, you'll notice as we have the initial one, and there's 2 there because I forgot to clear the log cap. But you'll notice we have the initial one, and then the title is incrementing as we click that, but we weren't relogging that we were sorting because that's expected. We don't need to sort because the items, the key didn't change. Well, what if you want to have an internal state? Well, we can do that the same. So we'll build a sample selector, have a couple of them, and selectable box is really a checkbox. I just wanted to make something a little bit more flashy. So here I built an int wrapper. It's really just a wrapper class for a variable integer, and we're updating the selection, that variable integer, to whatever we clicked on. Now I'll go ahead and run this. While it loads. All right, so as we're running, you'll notice, well, we're clicking on the items and it's highlighting that it's clicked, but it's not actually like updating the selection state. And that comes down to how Compose works and understands that it needs to be recomposed. So here we can easily swap out that int wrapper with Compose's framework version of that called mutable state. So we'll get a new one through mutable state of and then provide a default value. The difference between mutable state or a state and what we did with the int wrapper is the mutable state and state interact with Compose and inform it when that value changes that it's holding. Our int wrapper wasn't doing that, so Compose didn't know it needed to recompose. Now, if we had like another button there and that would force a recomposition, it would have, and clicked that, it would have updated the visual representation of what was selected, but we didn't have that set up. So we could have updated the int wrapper to do that functionality, or because the framework provides it, we'll just use mutable state of. Did I run this video? No. Thank you. All right, so as you can tell, now as we click them, it's appropriately updating the representation of which one is selected. So one note, you can use property delegation, and you probably should be using property delegation when you're using a mutable state, unless you're passing the mutable state around as a state object. In this case, I just left it as an equals because I wanted it to be consistent with how we were using the int wrapper. And I didn't want to build the get and set methods for an int wrapper that I was going to throw away. All right. So if you've used Compose before, you probably noticed something that may not be great with that view. I'll go ahead and play this. Note, this code is the same. I didn't change this code from the last slide. And I apologize for the quality of this. I'm going to try to pause it. Oh, no, different screen. I was going to try to pause it. But you'll notice here, and I'll just explain it because it's hard to see. The sample selector, every time you update a selection, is recomposing. So that parent container is recomposing for each selection change. Not only that, but each of those selectable boxes is also attempting to recompose anytime one of the selection changes. Now, Compose is being a little bit smart here, and for each of those, half of the time, so 2 times, it's skipping recomposition because nothing changed that it knows of, and 2 times it is recomposing. Now, for each of those items, I should say. Now, each of those items recomposing twice is expected. 1 recomposition for when we deselected each item, and 1 composition for when you selected it. And we went through and selected each item, so each one should have 2. Now we can simplify, or excuse me, we can fix that in this case by allowing the selectable box itself to determine if it is selected or not, and not have to pass in that selection state which causes that recomposition each time one of the selections changes. So here, we just updated the selectable box to take the item, in this case it's just a number, the selection, which is passed through as a state now instead of a value, and then onClick is the same. So if we look at the selectable box, you'll notice we have selected, which is calculated based off of the selection value and the item. Now, you will also notice that is actually in the scope or in a function called derived state of. This is something that I haven't used very often, but is very beneficial in cases like this, where the arguments that are being passed in, or in this case, the selection state, is changing more frequently than what your UI will need to represent. And so what you're saying with derived state is, I'm understanding that these incoming things are changing more frequently. Just pay attention to what I'm computing and use that as the key moving forward. So selected is what we're passing in to the selectable box in this case. So now it's letting the this new selectable box wrapper handle that selection. So if I run it, again, sorry about the quality. I thought it was going to be better than it was. So you'll notice, maybe if you can't notice because it's hard to see, but the parent composable is not recomposing at all. And then each of the sample selectors is only recomposing twice, not even attempting to recompose the other 2 times. So we've optimized the recompositions, and recompositions are a pretty expensive process, as we saw before, because they have to go through all of that logic and build the tree. Now, this is kind of a contrived example. In real world, if I had this, I probably wouldn't have done this optimization because there's not that many views. The performance probably really isn't that bad. So you just need to pay attention to, like, how complicated is your screen? Are you actually seeing performance degradation on certain devices? And then only if you are seeing that, then you would go through a performance optimization like this. Our favorite topic for everybody that builds Android apps, accessibility. If you are like me, you have probably either intentionally and unintentionally skipped accessibility when building your views. Compose actually kind of forces you in some cases to include accessibility information. For example, a icon in Compose, one of the required arguments is a content description. Now you can pass null if your icon doesn't actually do anything, but you should be passing in like a string when it does actually do something. So if it's like a delete icon and it deletes, then you should be passing in like delete or delete and then some additional name for what it is acting upon. But what I'm interested in here is if we have a drawer header. Now you will notice this actually looks like a list item. I built it as a list item, and I will get back to why I'm not calling it a list item. So here we just have an avatar. I got lazy and didn't build the monogram into the avatar, so just pretend it's there. And then we have the name of the user and their status, their subscription status. So the problem is accessibility sees this as 3 different fields. They see the monogram and then the name and then the subscription status. And so as you're going through a selection in your accessibility framework, it will go through all 3 of these and read out all 3 of them. That's not ideal because this is one item in like your navigation drawer, and we don't want to do that. So Compose adds accessibility through what they call a semantics modifier. In this case, there's 2 parts of this that I want to focus on. One is the merge descendants. Remember I mentioned that previously with our 3 different items, the avatar and the name and the status, when you're going through with focus, it would focus those as 3 different items. Merge descendants will merge all of those items into a single item as far as the accessibility framework is concerned. And then because we did that, we also want to give it a content description in this case. So underneath properties, I added a content description and just passed in the name. You might want to pass in the membership status. I wanted to make it concise for this slide presentation so you could actually read what I was doing. So I just made it as the name. And now Compose, the accessibility framework will see it as a single item and then read out the name when it's selected, and then the user can go ahead and move on to the next item. There's a couple of other properties that may be of interest to you. Like if you're building a text field, then text is an important one to use. Another one is there is a test ID. I think it's test ID. It might be test tag. That one is not useful for accessibility. It's useful for testing. So if you're doing UI testing and you want to ensure like a specific view is on screen, then you can use that, which is really beneficial and so much nicer than
UI Automator and other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's super handy if you make your own, like, I made our own, like, SN Appian test tag modifier.
Oh, yeah.
Like, you can just call that, because then you're not having to do the dot semantics
Yeah,
and everything.
that is one of the big benefits of modifiers. You can build your own. So you could, like what you were just saying, you can build a modifier that would simplify just adding a test tag. And so it could just be like dot test tag, and then you pass in that. And then under the covers, it would be calling dot semantics properties test.
There is just a test tag you can add.
Is there one?
Semantics.
There didn't always be. There used to not be. So there might be now.
I think it also, with Appium, at least when we were doing it, if it's just the test tag, like it wasn't always getting caught as an ID, because we were mainly dealing with, hey, we have a view world and a compose world, where view is expecting
working
an
with
ID,
both.
and then compose we don't have IDs, so like test tag wasn't always getting triggered.
So you like added both.
But if we wrapped it in semantics,
Nice.
it was.
So you can put test tag in semantics?
I think so
as well.
I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, we'd have.
I built it like 6 months.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you can add your own semantics. I just don't remember how you do that.
But yeah,
Or your own properties in semantics.
it's handy to do though. Like just-
Yes. Yeah. It's great. Great point. All right. So let's talk about performance. All right. We talked about this a little bit already. But let's talk about text field performance. I'm just going to run this and show you why I hate the current implementation of text fields. This is the layout inspector, and any text modification in a text field causes the parent layout to recompose. It's terrible, especially when you have multiple text fields. So that is due to how Compose, or your Material 2 and Material 3 libraries from Google for Compose, have exposed your text fields. They take a value. So what I do is I wrap a text field in another text field. Okay, in another composable function that takes a mutable value and lets that text field itself handle the determination of that. So you can see that here, we're just setting the value of that mutable state. And then I optimized it so you didn't have to pass in a value change. If you wanted to not do that, you could just call value change instead of setting the value to the value. And then we just pass in the modifier. Now, this is a very simple example. There's like 20 different arguments on a text field, and most of those you will probably want to use from one time to another. But yeah, this is a great starting point. And what this looks like now, the implementation now just looks like that. And now I'm going to run the video, and you'll notice once it loads that as we type text, typing the same text in, it's only recomposing the text field. This is really nice when you have a complex layout with a lot of text fields, so you're only recomposing what you need to only recompose. This is a good thing to think about moving forward just in general with Compose, that you want to ensure that you're trying to limit your compositions to the smallest scope possible.
How are you issuing the red effect for a recomposition?
So that's in the layout inspector.
Okay.
You can also, well, I don't know if the Android, your developer tools on the device would show that. I don't think they would. They show redraw, so it might still show up, but yeah, that is specifically tied to composition, and it's visible in the layout inspector. Similar to what we were seeing with the composition count, it's actually just the window next to it that I clipped out.
There's also some people in the early days of Compose, it is common to sometimes see people when people are debugging, they'd throw in a border and they'd increase the size of the border for every recomposition because they're able to be like, okay, this thing's like
the
early days of Compose had some very unique solutions.
Yeah, having this in layout inspector is actually pretty recent, and it is so nice because early I was playing around with early Compose too, and you're like, how do I determine if it's recomposing? And Google's like, oh, I don't know.
Yeah. Also, you'll in terms of text fields, I can't remember if the recommended way is mutable state of or having a mutable state flow. I think it's
Both.
mutable state flow is the recommended.
Yeah, that gets into preference a little bit,
Yeah.
but yeah, Google does recommend mutable state flow. When I do my own input fields, I actually have a separate wrapper around some values. So it has the value of the input field, also has a callback for when it changes, error information, and usually like enabled, disabled type of stuff. And that object is passed around. But the value and the error state, anything that can change, those are mutable states themselves. And so the object I just pass in once, and then those are either mutable states or states and kind of get modified appropriately. But yeah, there's a lot of ways to do text input.
The main reason Google recommends certain ways over others isn't actually because of recomposition counts. It's because of you can run into interesting situations where your cursor can end up in the wrong spots. And,
yes.
Or inputs are put in wrong if you're doing any sort of formatting. Or
yeah,
formatting a phone number or something.
Yeah.
Like it can get.
Yeah, cursor in the wrong spot can be a little bit iffy. It also goes to like, what do you think is the source of truth? Because sometimes like I like the view model itself or the use case to be enforcing a particular thing about that text. And I don't want to have to duplicate that in the UI itself. So yeah, there are definitely some circumstances that you can play around a bit with that. All right, so let's talk about modifiers and performance. Yay. Let's talk about list performance. So if you've talked to anybody that has used Compose and asked them about lists, they've probably said that the performance of a list is okay at best. This has changed recently with last two minor versions of Jetpack Compose. And this comes into the modifier and how it works. So pre 1.3 in Compose, the modifier has an element. And that element really kind of takes two forms. The first form is kind of a static value. So like when you specify padding or a margin, that's usually like a static value. It doesn't change between your different layout passes or doesn't retain any state associated with what it's doing. Where you do have others that retain state. So like clickable, it needs to be able to animate and do that ripple and understand selectability and focusability. So in Compose, they use what's called a composed modifier, which is really a modifier that has a compose lambda inside of it that is doing stuff that depends on composable state information. Now, the problem with this is they needed to remember a lot of information across different compositions. And so they used a lot of those remember keywords and derive state of keywords. And because of the way that modifiers are set up, between different compositions, it can't actually reuse the same modifiers. So it's rebuilding your modifier every time you recompose a screen.
The modifier was the same.
Yeah, there was no way for it to key and understand if a modifier was the same or changed.
And then on top of that, like when it's building the tree, when it's building the tree of all of your composables, for each modifier you have on a composable, technically it could be making this huge other tree.
Yes, yeah. So for example, clickable actually is not just one modifier element. I don't have element on the screen, but it's not one modifier element. It's actually like 26. And so you can see why if you use modifiers and then have a list, it can really impact the performance, especially when you're recomposing stuff, because it causes all of those items to go through and do computation and memory access and storage. So with Compose 1.3, they introduced the concept of a node. Now this is all internals, like pretty much anybody that's using Compose doesn't have to worry about making any changes for this to work, unless you made your own modifiers, in which case you might want to look at Node. But I can't remember the exact specifics of it, but they updated the modifier to now use this node, which an element now has a node. And internally, that node is now can be reused across different compositions. And so when you're going and building out your modifier tree, it can see, oh, this is this clickable. We'll just use the last one because nothing changed. And so you'll see a lot better performance because it's not building that massive tree of modifiers, and it's not like reallocating or garbage collecting memory. So you're going to see big performance gains when you move from Compose 1.2 to 1.3, and then they're going to continue to phase this in over the next few minor releases of Compose.
So you don't have to do anything, or you have to do equals compose?
You don't have to do anything. The modifier.clickable equals composed is actually the definition of clickable. If you look at it, I specifically had it here so that I could point out there are composed modifiers and then more like static modifiers.
Each modifier has this.
So not all of them. So like clickable, selectable have composed. Sorry, what was that?
So the ones that would have like a separate tree of like a lot of.
Typically, yeah. So anything that requires like composition information, so like a screen density to calculate from DPs to PX, or in this case, a lot of other stuff like the ripple animation and colors and things like that. Yeah, so some of them have, well, a fair amount of the ones that you will typically use have composed, and then there's a couple others that don't.
Generally speaking, you won't have to worry about this unless you're using your own modifiers. Like I made a debounce clickable where like it would actually only allow you to click once every 300 milliseconds. That way, like, because in the earlier days before they made some improvements to navigation, you could actually cause your navigation to crash if you double clicked on a button, and it would try to go to the same place with it. Like it just
yeah. So. Yeah, the only time you really need to know about this is if you're building your own modifiers.
In which case you do the equals composed.
If you wanted a composed modifier, yeah.
Just depends on what you want to build. Yeah. I mean, there's so many modifiers that generally when you're making a modifier, like you're not going to be doing something like this.
No, it's
doing like
combining a couple of existing ones usually.
Like making that semantic one that we talked about.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
The only reason I bring this up is because it has a pretty big impact on list performance and just performance in general. And I find a lot of people don't actually know that Google was making this migration because they didn't have to do anything. All right. So the other one I want to talk about is when you have a modifier value that is changing frequently. So for example, you're animating the position of an item. There are two different types of modifier arguments. In this case, offset has two variants. One, the one on the left takes a static value, and the one on the right takes a provider for that value. So when you are frequently changing that value, you should prefer the one on the right that is a provider. The reason for that is when it reads that value. So the one on the left, in order to update that offset, which you will be doing 30, 60, 90, 120 times a second, depending on the refresh rate of your device, it will need to recompose to update that value, which, as we just saw and we talked about throughout this presentation, composition itself is pretty expensive. Whereas the one on the right, where it takes a provider, that is accessed in the layout portion of the phases. So remember, it was composition, then layout, then drawing. So it doesn't need to go through composition at all to update the value. It just goes through the layout, which is much more performant because, again, layout is a single pass layout, and then it can go ahead and do the drawing. So when you're modifying things like this, where you're animating or just frequently updating it, try to prefer those provider or the Lambda variants of the functions. Now, not all of them have it. Offset is a good example that has it. I'm not sure of others that if they do or do not have it. I just wanted to point out, like
for background, you do draw behind.
Yeah, background.
Or like draw with cache or something like that.
Yeah, so you can do draw behind for a background, or draw with cache is a little bit different if you're doing like custom custom drawing type stuff. And that kind of gets into custom components, which I really wanted to get into, but building the slides is like, there's no way I'm going to get into that where anybody's going to understand. Cool. So let's talk about a little bit about code organization. I want to specifically focus on a screen right now. If you don't know this terminology, a screen, just think about it as like a fragment or an activity. So here I have a login screen, and we can think about it as a set of inputs and outputs. The view model is the input here, and then the output would be, when the login is successful or when the user navigates back if they have like a toolbar or app bar in the login screen. Now, Google actually recommends defining your screens as a set of inputs for each thing that you need. So in this case, it would be, for your username field, it would be the username state and the callback for when it's changed. Same with the password. And then I also have allow login, which is dependent on what your username and password is, if they're populated or not. Now, I actually kind of combine these two. I like the implementation that something is calling a screen to be as simple as possible. So I still require and expose the login screen that is just the view model and then the outputs. And then internally, I immediately convert that to a private version of this that takes the individual fields and then the outputs. And the reason for that is preview. You are not going to be able to preview if you have a view model as your argument, because your view model probably uses Android stuff. So if you're using like save state holder, and it's probably going to be using like use cases or repositories, all of which either you're going to have to try to mock or just don't do it. just do something like this, and then internally within that file, build your preview and point it to this style of login screen.
You also get some other benefits. Testability.
Testability, yep.
Test this first, test with view model. Reusability.
Mm-hmm.
Like I ran into this just recently where I was needing to handle uploading a document, but and I had a screen, but this other implementation of it, what the location of the data and everything was just slightly different enough.
Yep.
That cool. I just have this wrapper that does this style and this wrapper that does this style, but under the hood, it's still this login screen.
Yeah.
So like splitting it out that way, and then also you get you can dive into like KMP type stuff.
Yeah, you get a lot of multi-platform stuff. You get a lot of recomposition improvements in this way. Like if you're excessively causing composition in other places, there's just a lot of benefits to doing it as exposing the view model and then internally like immediately converting and doing what you need. So let's talk a little bit about grouping. We talked about earlier about having a composable method that's like 200 lines long. Don't do that. I mean, we talked about recomposition, and I think you can kind of see where I'm going with that. If something is causing something else to recompose more, then that's probably going to cause the whole screen to recompose if you all have it in one function. So you should group things that are similar. So in this case, I would group, I'm going to skip the toolbar along the top because that's kind of already grouped. So I would group your plus or your up and down thumbs, and then the name of the album and song. I would also group your positional information, and then of course your playback functionality, your buttons. And all of those to me feel like those are different groups, like rows or whatever, inside of the broader column that is the screen. That will help with recomposition. It'll help with readability. It'll help with previews. So you can preview each of these separate groups by itself and all of the states that are associated with that. And that's it. If you want to stick around, I can do a fairly quick demo of building a login screen that kind of brings all of what we talked about together, and just show you how I typically like split things out and would build a pretty simplified login screen. Like it's not going to contain all of the states that we want. Let me, was I sharing a screen or a window?
Also a good rule of thumb when you're,
dang it,
when you group your functions,
The meeting ended at 7.
Oh, the meeting.
The
team.
my room, yeah, Teams. Well, not Teams, but
The TV turned off, so it turns off.
my calendar meeting.
But when you group your functions,
Oh, I see.
so like when you make that playback bar and everything, it's a very good practice to always have a modifier as one of the parameters. Like when you're making your functions.
Yeah. Always pass in a modifier. Sorry, we're trying to get our TV locally to work.
I'm going to try and extend the meeting. See if it comes
Well,
back.
the meeting itself is still running.
Well, not meeting, but
The,
There it is.
the calendar invite for the room. Yeah.
Oh.
In Outlook. So I just did it
Oh, for like next time.
not just
just today, so that this room is back in the meeting again.
Oh, okay, I see.
So it doesn't auto turn off.
All right. Sorry, I have to like shift because I'm on a separate screen here. All right, and then let's do. Oh, why did you not do my key command? Okay. I did not practice this going on a separate screen. All right. So here we have a simple setup for a login screen. We have a preview. Again, that's just calling that split out functionality that we just saw. We have the view model version that goes and splits it out from the view model. Also pays attention to the login result. Doesn't actually do anything in the view model right now, but that's a way to do it so that you can collect like a network result and then kick that out to your output from that function.
So is login screen the highest level composable, or is it a wrapper over?
So login screen, this one that takes a view model. I use public or internal when I do modules and tie it into navigation. Those are always my exposed ones. And then if I scroll down, you'll notice this is private. So this is the one that obviously isn't public. We can go ahead and get rid of this. So when I'm building a login screen, what's the first thing I need? Well, I need a username and a password field. So I'll throw that in a column. Make sure that, I'm going to add a modifier. I can type fill max width, because we want it to wrap the content as a height, but we want it to fill the width. And then I'm going to go ahead and do an outlined text field. Text field. I really wish it would do these on new lines by default. All right, just for Compose though. All right, so value in this case, I don't have any input stuff. So I'm gonna just quickly come back up here. There's username on username change, password on password change. And I'm actually gonna use these in a minute as well. So I'm just gonna copy all of that, bring those in as arguments. And here, the value, username, again, I'm not going to do it here, but I would normally use a wrapped text field. I just didn't have one set up for this case. And then on username change. Cool. So we have that one. And then we can do a second one for the password. Password.
And those are states, not mutable states, right?
Correct. I'm passing them around as states because I'm using this change callback to actually manage the changing. You could pass it around as just a mutable state. In this case, I'm just using the callback to do that so that I can do some additional like checks in the view model, which aren't actually being done in this case. But
you can like validate the password that it's correctly.
Yeah, I would more validate the email formatting, like, the username, which is actually an email, is in the format of an email.
Right.
Yeah. So we have those two. I'm going to leave that there for now, and then we'll come back to it. Cool. So here in the screen, now we see, we'll just do a column again. I was doing that earlier too. But because this is the parent one, I'm just going to have it fill the max size. And let's go ahead and add our input fields. Yep. Oops, dang it. And then this trailing lambda, which I don't actually want as a trailing lambda, is on login equals on login. Cool. We have the input fields. So now we also want a button to actually log in. So let's go ahead and do a button. I actually have one that's called an action button that just simplifies the text. Normally you'd have to pass in a composable lambda for the content of the button. In this case, I just wrapped it and took text. So you'll notice I'm using string resource. This is a function that ties into the composable state to tie into your string resources. Login, screen, login. And that's how you do it. Pretty simple. And then on click, in this case, action button, well, we want it to log in, so we'll just go ahead and do that. So now if I come over here and actually split, you'll notice once it builds, is it? It is. Okay, cool. That doesn't look like what we have. It should not quite look like that. There it is. Okay. So you got a sneak peek of the improvements we're going to make. So you'll see that we have the username field. It's pre-populated because the view model, I actually have it the preview I have pre-populated with a username, and the password is also pre-populated. I see a few issues. One, password is visible. Like I can read the password. That's not great. Like location of everything is kind of pretty ugly, and there's no indication of what field is what. It's like when there's no content, we wouldn't know that is a username on the top and password on the bottom. So if we come back over here to our input fields, let's go ahead and add a label, a composable function for the label, and then let's just add a text. There we go. And in this case, the text is going to be another string resource. Login, username. Something to note, for some reason for string resource, I do not pass in a named argument, but everything else I pass a named argument in. So it's ID equals r.string.login. For me, I'm like, I already know I'm passing in an ID. But anyways, and then I pretty much always by convention put those on new lines. So I'm just going to copy this for the password field. Going to add that there, and then just change this to login screen password. And now you'll notice the preview does do a weird thing with text fields where it looks like there's a line going through it. That doesn't actually happen when you run it. It's just something weird difference between the preview and what is actually going on. If it really bothers you, you could add a background to your label, but not a big deal. All right. So we've done that with the input field. Sorry, I did not.
Add like was it IME options or something? Like,
yes. Glad you asked that. That's exactly what we're going to do. All right. So on the password field, there are two things. There's a bunch of options here. If you really want to read through them quick, you can see what they are. But the important ones are keyboard options and keyboard actions. So let's do keyboard options. So keyboard options are how you can specify things like keep it capitalized, autocorrect, keyboard type, the IME action. I'm going to use one because it's the password field. So I'm going to do IME action. And that's going to be an IME action send because we're the password field. I want to send the login. Well, to actually...
It's the last input, right, on your page.
Yeah, the last input. Yeah, password in this screen is the last input. That's what I want to do. And then because we want to tie into that action, we're going to use keyboard actions. you'll notice there's a couple variants. One is on any, and one is all your individual IME actions that you can do. In this case, I'm just going to do the on any because, well, I don't actually care if the IME action is a little bit different. And then here, we'll just do a quick check if login allowed value, because it's a state. Then we'll do on login. That's how you can do the keyword. Thought I clicked on that. All right, so that's how you can add that keyword action to that. Now we're going to want to do a very similar thing.
You don't pass like the username and password inside of that on login call. You don't pass those up? Or?
So this login call, the way I'm doing it, it's calling into the view model, and the view model already has the information for the username and password. Okay. I do that because...
where does it pass it to the view model?
Great question. Yeah, so when we're calling on password change, if we follow that up, input fields to the screen, which calls on password change or on username change.
So those are like output.
Yep. Yep. So you'll notice here it's calling viewModel.set username, viewModel.set password. If you're unfamiliar with the syntax, by the way, this is just saying the set password function in the view model. All right, so let's go ahead and do keyboard options and keyboard actions. Oh, geez.
Where do you set the password type, like the IME option?
Oh, you're right.
Is that the keyboard options?
Yep. It's keyboard type. Okay. My order wrong? No, I guess it is the last one. It should be fine, but keyboard type that password. Right, I missed that. All right, so if we come back up here, I'm going to add a space between these so now that we can better understand what is going on. And then add my actions again. This one is going to be next because the username field comes before the password, so I want it to go to the password field. And then the action on any, well, we're not logging in there. We want to focus the password field, but how do we do that? So Compose has what's called a focus manager. Sorry, it took me a moment. Well, focus manager equals, remember, focus, and oh, maybe it's just remember focus manager. Oh, local focus manager.current. So this is a format that Compose follows to get kind of some like stateful information for your composables. Typically, they'll call it local something. So in this case, local focus manager just gets the focus manager that's working on the screen that you're currently presenting. There are other ones. There is like a local density that you can get the current screen density that you can convert from a DP to a pixel. There's local context and a bunch of other local items that you can use throughout your composables. In this case, we just want the focus manager. Now, I can come down, oops, scrolled too far. Now I can come back down here to the email or the username field, and I can do focus manager dot move focus. And because Compose is already handling the focus ordering in this case, I can do focus direction dot down, and that will automatically focus the password field when we click next on the keyboard. But we can improve this even more. What if when we open the screen, we want the password field to be focused? So this is why I got messed up for a moment. Val?
So it's not by default.
It's not by default.
Like the whole window is focused, or
yeah, it's like nothing's really focused by default. This is why it took me a moment with the focus manager. So focus requester, remember focus requester. So there is a focus requester. And then here in the outline text field, I skipped a step. All right, so I'll pass in a modifier. Modifier focus requester equals focus requester. Comma. Cool. So now we're tying that focus requester, go away, to the outline text field that represents the username. But this by itself doesn't do anything. We actually have to trigger the focus requester. So another thing that I didn't go over, I actually deleted the slide that had it, is there are effects in Compose. Two primary ones. There is a launched effect and a side effect. Launched effect happens once for just on the initial composition or per keys that you're passing in, and side effect will happen every composition. So in that case, we want launched again.
Focus the first few.
Yep, I'm going to tie it to the focus requester. And then here, I'm just going to say focus requester dot request focus. And now on the initial composition, when that key changes, so technically when it's first initialized, it'll go ahead and focus that email address field or the username field. This is pretty much it as far as a lot of those things go. There are one more thing we want to do on the password field.
So you don't have to explicitly connect the focus manager with the focus requester.
No.
Independently.
Yeah,
do the job.
yeah.
You're on the username.
Am I on the user? I am on the username. That would be fun. You can't see what username you're typing in. All right, so here there is a transformation we can apply. It's called visual transformation. I can type. There are a couple of visual transformations. The default one is none, so it just shows you what you have. But there's a predefined one called a password visual transformation.
The keyboard type itself did not mask out
Correct.
the letters, right?
Right.
So
So
like
yeah.
it would be, it'd
So
make
what
it so
would
like
it do?
you'd have your number up.
Mhm.
And like you could do the same thing on the username where you could make it a email one so it has the @ symbol in the keyboard. and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it affects what the keyboard looks like, but not what the input.
But password really wouldn't do much except keep it all in one line. Like
The,
not wrapping. Or...
The keyboard, depending on the keyboard you're using, the specific, how do I even say that? The app that presents a keyboard, they are a little bit different based on what these IME types are. And so like the password is a specific type. Some of them will show a couple of symbols and your number row. Others will just show the number row.
Yeah, okay.
So that's really all that's doing. So you do need the visual transformation. Improvement I would make on the password field that I'm not going to do here is I would add a toggle to hide and show the password. So it would basically be enabling or disabling the visual transformation.
And it probably comes with a default icon. Or do you have to supply
you'd
it?
make your own.
You'd make your own or just use the Compose icons library, which includes like a eye and then an eye with a cross through it, which would represent visibility and not visible.
There's some really cool things you can do with the visual transformation though. Like
Yeah.
I made a passcode screen
Mhm.
where you can only put in 4 digits and I just either show by default I show 4 empty circles and as you type it just replace
Yeah,
it with
you-
filled circle. Like you can do cool things.
You can do some really cool, like when I was at Elements, which is a financial technology company, I built a visual transformation for numbers that would correctly add commas and enforce decimal places as you were typing, which is pretty cool.
For international, like swap the period and the comma. Like in Europe, they have a
Yes.
comma for the dot.
Yep.
and dots.
Yeah, I built it to be international.
That's legit.
It was really fun to do. All right. One last thing. I mean, I could do a lot more tweaks to this, right? The other thing that you'd probably want to do on yours is add a modifier. Fill max width. Probably want to do that on this one as well, just so that it actually, is filling the parent. Fill max width. And then I would probably add spacing between them. I originally planned on, but I think right now we've probably spent enough time, and I think you kind of understand how everything is going about in this case.
You got the dots again? I think I missed that last part.
The
You got
dots.
The transformation to change the password to dots.
The
password visual.
Yeah.
So that's just available.
Yep. So I can get rid of that, and then. Yep.
Cool. So hopefully your designers like the.
They don't have to. You can pass in your own character.
Hopefully they have a character they want.
Yes. If they don't, you can build your own visual transformation. I mean, yeah, you could use whatever you want, because this is just a predefined one which extends visual transformation. If we look at implementations, there's a date and password provided for you, and none technically. But.
And pro tip, by the way, since Compose is built fully in the open, you can easily dive in and see all the code. And
yes,
everything.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite things with Compose. Like, you can actually see what the UI is doing and how it's doing it.
More so than you would with the old XML.
Way more, yeah. And it's not like you click into something that you think is innocuous and you hit a 10,000 line view file.
I think they gave the example of a button, where a button is supposed to be like this block that does this, but like in the view world, a button underneath the hood is a text field with all this other stuff.
Yeah.
And like it became like this 10,000 thing long.
By the way, speaking of padding and margins, buttons are a pain in XML land.
Yeah. So one of their goals with Compose was like your composable should only do what it is needed to do. So like I recently saw a debate where, hey, why do you provide this outline text field and this other text field and this other one? Why not just one text field that has these design parameters? And it's like, well, if we did that, that's a slippery slope that leads to us having this 10,000 long line thing that's overly complicated.
Yep.
So no, just keep it simple.
So I mentioned earlier that we were going to just show you how that runs in the application. So here on the left, we're looking at the preview, which has 3 options. 1, start animation preview. I mean, if you're doing animations, that's great. I usually don't use it that often. Start interactive mode. This is really nice if you want to just see like what the focusability looks like, maybe clicking it, what that looks like without actually having to run it in the app. And then run preview, 3rd option. This will run it in your emulator or physical device. So I clicked that, and now we're running in the application or in the physical emulator. Wow, physical emulator. We're running in the emulator. And you can see that the email address field was automatically selected. The cursor position could be improved in that case because it was pre-populated. Not great, but you can select over. And then really?
If you adjust your size of your emulator, the pane.
You're talking about this thing?
Move that over.
There it is. I just have a glare like right in that corner. So
is your zoom options were blocking
your. Yeah. All right. So now if I hit next, it focuses on the password field. And then on the password field, if it has send, I click send. Apparently I long clicked it. Oops. If I click send, it's actually not doing anything because on login is not tied to anything, but it would normally actually tie in.
With that login button.
Yeah.
The one above.
There you go. Yeah, it mimics exactly what this is doing. So as an example, typically on the login, I would also tie that to like stripping focus. Obviously you want to either disable your input fields, maybe show a different UI to indicate that you're actually sending something. You want to handle the error states. There's so much more that you can handle and should handle in this specific example of the screen. But as far as like the basics go, I felt like this was a good, somewhat short way to show that.
This is great. You hinted it with keyboard options and stuff like that, but like there's ways you can make it so it's a lot more friendly for different form factors by like, because for example, if you're typing on your computer all the time when you're going through your app, it's nice to be able to tap between fields of like you can actually set. Like I know you did keyboard any, but like you can actually set like if it's tab, do this. If it's Control C or Control V, like you can actually set those
for debugging.
Yeah. So the default ones are just like your standard IME stuff. But what he was saying, if we click into on any, you'll notice that it's it's an action scope in this case. There's a different way to tie in to get the tab.
Yeah, I usually see it as it's like INE action dot, and then it's
I'm trying to remember how you do it.
or
Yeah,
tab.
Yeah.
Like, you can see it because it's, for example, if you have a tablet, it's common that people with tablets would have a Bluetooth keyboard or something attached to it.
So
like being able to
tab, you want to focus the next field like it does on your laptop or desktop.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm about to die. So I think that was good.
Yeah.